And welcome, Starlink Realty. Ernesto here. Super excited to work with you today on the anatomy of a real estate transaction. Right here before you on your screen is the anatomy of a real estate transaction. So why do we go over this document? Well, because it is the baseline for everything, right? It's a big picture of what you're going to encounter as you get into the field of real estate, right? How do you negotiate an offer? Why should you have a qualification letter when you do that? Why should you run comparables? What happens when a property goes under contract, and what happens with the escrow? What's the difference between finance contingency and cash? What happens during the inspections, and why does that sometimes trigger another round of negotiations, right? That also happens with appraisals. Why? So we're going to answer all of that today and a whole bunch more stuff right here. So stay tuned, starting right now. Welcome back, everybody. So you've shown a whole bunch of properties. You've gone there, you've looked. Your customer tells you, this is it, Ernesto. This is the one I want. Let's make an offer. This is the one I want to get into. All right, great. How do we make that offer stand out against a whole bunch of other offers in a hot market like what we're dealing with right now? How do you make that offer unique? Okay. How do you make it where it actually makes sense? You guys always hear me telling you, chess, not checkers. This is all a part of the same process. Okay, your offer on paper that you present to the listing agent should always have a qualification letter to it. It's right there in purple. And here's why we want to have that. Because we want to show that seller, the listing agent as well, but we want to show that seller that our offer is qualified. We have done the homework. We know that our customer is qualified, or we would not be submitting the offer. Okay, if a listing agent has 4 offers in front of her, and she sees that they're all pretty competitive, but only one of them actually has a pre-qualification letter, there's a good chance that that offer is going to be the one that is actually selected. Okay, so keep that in mind. Why do we run comparables at the same time that we submit the offer? Well, that's a really great question, and the answer is even better. The reason why we do that is because not only are we educating ourselves as to what the real value is of that particular property, we don't pay attention to what the asking price is. Okay, the asking price can be anything, basically. It's what the seller thinks, it's what the agent thinks. It's a very subjective process by which they arrive at the asking price. So what do we do as professional real estate agents? We go and we look to make sure that that property listed for $300,000 is actually worth $300,000, because if it's not, our offer had better reflect, you know what? Here's some comparables, and it looks like this property may sell for $278,000. Here's an offer for $272,000 for you to consider. Now, you're not lowballing the offer. You're actually re-educating the listing agent and that seller. This is where your property should have been listed at in the first place. So while we're on that topic, I want to share something with you. Let me ask you this question. How do people search online? How do people search on the MLS? How do people search on Zillow? Do people go 299.9 to 315, or do people go 300,000 to 320 or 330 or 340? People use round numbers. Okay, so we also want to use round numbers. Why? Because that's the way people search. So let me give you this example. Okay, I've got this property here, and I just ran comparables on this home. This home is listed at $329,000. My customer wants to look at properties between $250,000 and $300,000. I found the perfect property at $329,000, and when I ran the comps, I found out that that property will sell for $298,000. Perfect. Do you see how that works? This is why we run comparables. This is why we do the extra research, because then we can put a contract in front of somebody that says, you know what, I've done the homework, I've done the research, I know this property will sell for somewhere between $298,000 and $305,000. So here's an offer for $290,000, okay? Because we want to negotiate with you. We don't want to offend the seller, but we want to engage the seller. And the way we do that is by running the comparables, figuring out what the real price of the property should be, and then going backwards from there. It is ideal that we do that, because that is how we earn the listing agents and the sellers respect early on in the transaction, because they know that we're doing our homework, they know that we're not fooling around, they know that we're not newbies, they know that we're working hard for our client, and that we're not going to leave any stone unturned on their behalf. All right, so that takes care of comparables. And of course, we talked about qualification letter. We need the qualification letter so that the lender has something they've already seen what this buyer looks like on paper, right? So they have an idea. Yes, they're going to be able to qualify for this property. Go ahead. Here's a pre-qual letter. Send it in with all your offers. You'll be in great shape to negotiate for your next offer. All right. So next, we're going to talk about what happens when the property goes on the contract, the escrow deposit, and then next line. See you in a second. So you got your property under contract. Congratulations. Great job. How do you know that you're under contract? All right, let's go over that really quick. Right here in blue, property under contract. Let's explore that a little bit further. Okay, what that means under contract. It means that you have a meeting of the minds. Remember that. It means that you have a meeting of the minds that is also supported by signatures on a piece of paper. No ambiguities. An entire set of thoughts and processes and terms and conditions and prices, everything in one document signed by all parties involved. Okay, it could be two people. It's no less than two people, but it could be two people, and it could be a lot more than that. So that is how you know you're under contract. If I submit an offer today to somebody and they make a change to it and then they sign it, let's say, for example, my offer was $250 and they come back with $256. They go ahead and sign it. Now they give it back to me. What am I holding? I'm holding something called a counter offer. What that means is that they looked at my terms that I had put on the offer. They didn't agree with all of them. They agreed with most of them. So they went ahead and signed the document. But in doing so, they made one change to the contract. In this particular case, they added $6,000 to the asking price. It doesn't matter what they actually change. As long as they change one item and then they sign it, it is now called a counter offer. Now the buyer is the recipient of that counter offer. So the buyer's agent now has an offer to present to the buyer. You see how that works? Kind of flips over. So now the buyer decides, do I want to accept this offer the way it's written now with $6,000 extra? Do I want to negotiate or do I want to throw it in the trash? By the way, this is a good place for me to tell you there are three things and only three things that someone can do with an offer. Okay, one thing is they can sign it, meeting of the minds, boom, under contract, good to go. Number two, they can counter it, which means they make a change and they sign it. Number three, they can turn around and put it right in the trash. They do not have to respond. So when someone tells you, hey, I sent an offer to you, but your client never responded, how come you never responded? Of course, it's polite to respond. We're professional, so you should actually respond. But there is no legal process that says you have to respond, okay, if that makes sense. If the seller gets offended and the seller says, you know what, I want nothing to do with this buyer because this offer is just simply offending, I want you to throw it in the trash, our listing agent throws it in the trash, no more discussion. So of course that can happen as well. But let's get back to it. Property is now under contract. Per FREC, we have 3 days to receive the escrow deposit to be delivered to the listing agent via an escrow receipt. Okay, so you'll see this anatomy of a real estate transaction. I want to give you a little bit more information about why we do this. Okay, this is a part of a class that we call Real Estate 101. Real Estate 101 talks about contracts, talks about all the early tools that we learn about. This is, of course, why we do the anatomy of a transaction, because we want to lay out a process so that you can understand what happens first and next and next and so on and so forth. Kind of build a picture in your mind. So one of the things that has to happen right after the property goes on the contract is the escrow deposit has to go in place. Once we get into the contracts, you'll see that there's a 3-day window for the escrow receipt to find its way to the listing agent and the seller. Okay, that is per FREC law. See it right here in gray with a little arrow there. Proof of escrow must go to the listing agent. You see that? Proof of escrow to the listing agent. That is a FREC requirement. It's part of Florida law, so keep that in mind. All right. Property goes on the contract, escrow deposit, whether it's $1,000 or $10,000. We'll talk about escrow a little bit later. Proof of escrow, receipt goes to the listing agent. All right. Then you've got something called, well, what kind of an offer is it? Is it a finance offer or is it a cash offer? All right. That triggers a whole bunch of different things. If it's a cash offer, everyone loves the cash offer, right? Because it's super easy to close. There's not a whole bunch of conditions. There really is no need for an appraisal, although we always recommend that there is an appraisal just in case, because it helps to evaluate the property from a third party, et cetera, et cetera. But cash is super easy to do a transaction. Financing, of course, brings in a whole bunch of another layer of complexities, because that financing can come in by way of FHA, VA, government-backed loans like a USDA or something like that. It can also be a conventional loan. So there's all these different things that kind of play a role into that process. Once we get into the actual contract portion of it, we have to figure out, we're going to go into the actual inspections, and why do inspections many times lead to another round of negotiations. All right, so let's talk about the inspections. What are they? What are they good for? Why do we insist on having them? So the inspections are usually, when you go under contract, you have about somewhere between 10 and 14 days to do an inspection period. Inside of the inspection period, the buyer, and only the buyer, so long as you're using, hold on a second, so long as you're using this is an as-is contract. You see that right there? As is. This is part of Real Estate 101, and we're going to go over this real soon, but today we're going over the anatomy. So the as-is contract leaves within it somewhere between 15 days, 10 to 15 days. You can bring it all the way down to 7, but we'll talk about why I don't recommend that whenever we go over the contract. So let's call it 15 days. 15 days inspection, that means that the buyer has 15 days to do all the inspections that she wants to do. She can hire somebody. She can have Uncle Bob go see it. She can do the inspection herself. Of course, we professionals 100% of the time recommend that the inspection be done by an actual licensed, bonded, insured home inspector. Because what happens there is the inspector will give a 30 plus page report to the potential buyer, stating everything that is in the condition of the home. What's good, what's bad, what's old, what's nearing the end of life. That's what they call it, end of service life parameters or whatever. So now the buyer has a really good picture of what the condition is overall of the home. The reason why we go back into negotiations at that point is because now that the buyer understands, okay, so I made an offer for $300,000 on this home, assuming that everything in the home was in great shape. I come to find out now, because I have my inspection, that the roof is at end of life. The plumbing needs to be replaced. The electrical panel needs to be replaced because it's very old and it doesn't get insured anymore, so we need a new one. You start to add up all these different costs. Maybe the AC is also nearing the end of life. These are big ticket items, right? So now the buyer is going to say, well, the property that I thought was worth $300,000 is not quite worth $300,000. So we're going to have to get back to negotiations, and we're going to figure out, if anything, the seller is going to contribute to some of these repairs, if the seller is going to contribute to some of these items that are really old and nearing end of life, or if perhaps the seller is going to do nothing. And if the seller does nothing, then the buyer gets to decide, am I going to go forward with this transaction and continue to buy this property, or am I going to back out? So this is why I would say 90%, maybe more, of transactions that fall apart, they fall apart in the first 2 weeks for this reason right here, the inspections. Inspections are basically peeling back the onions of a home, the onion layers of a home, and figuring out what is the condition of everything. And once you have that, you negotiate properly to figure out, should you move forward, should you not move forward. By the way, while we're on this topic here, during the inspection period, it is only the buyer's discretion to decide whether he or she wants to buy the home. So for example, I look down and I see, okay, here we go. There's a little crack on the tile here, and I'm going to decide that I don't want to buy the house because of that little crack on the tile, right? So the seller says, but that's like a $15 item, Ernesto. Why would you do that? Well, because I just don't want to deal with it. So basically what the whole point of that is that the buyer, and only the buyer, has that much leverage to be able to decide, I want to keep the home, I want to not keep the home, I want to walk away. And if I walk away, I get back 100% of my escrow without anything being challenged. Of course, that changes after the 15th day when the inspection period ends. We're going to go deeper into that when we're dealing with the contracts. But for now, just so you know, the inspections, the buyer has all the discretion that he or she needs to either stay in the property, negotiate for a better deal, or walk. Cool? All right, so that's negotiations. We're going to come back in a second with seller's disclosure and a bunch of other stuff. See you in a minute. All right, let's get into it. Here we go. Seller's disclosure. What is the seller's disclosure? Why do we need one? Okay, a lot of people think, first off, seller's disclosure is mandatory. It is not mandatory. It's never mandatory. Think of it this way. You could have a seller that never lived in the property. You could have a seller that was an investor. You could have a seller that flipped the property. So the seller's disclosure is a document that's basically 4 or 5 pages. We're going to go over it a little bit later on, but it's 4 or 5 pages asking the seller to disclose anything and everything that may be wrong or is wrong with the property that's not readily observable. Okay, that is actually the definition of the seller's disclosure. It is not mandatory. I'll say that once again. But here's what is mandatory, okay? The seller's disclosure is not mandatory. What is mandatory is for the seller and also the seller's agent. I'm going to quiz you on this a little bit later. The seller's agent as well as the seller do have a duty, a legal duty to disclose any material fact that affects the value of the property, right? If it's readily visible, it's not a disclosable item. Keep that in mind. If there's a big giant hole in the first wall as you walk into the property, everybody can see it, it's not disclosable. But if it's something, for example, that the roof is leaking in a corner of a house and you have a bucket catching water on the other side, for example, on the far side of the attic, and it's not readily observable by the person who comes in to view the property, that is a disclosable item by the homeowner. He or she knows that it's catching water because there's a bucket there. That is a disclosable item. Carrying that over to the agent shares the same responsibility as an owner of having to disclose known material facts that can adversely affect the value of a home. So if the agent knows that information, the agents also have that responsibility, that legal responsibility to disclose. All right, I'm going to show you what it looks like real quick because it's right over here. Seller's property disclosure. Here's like 4 pages here, and it talks about, it explains it here a little bit. We're going to break this down in a later program where we're going to break this down line by line, and I'll share with you exactly how this works. For now, just recognize that it's part of the closing documents as we approach a closing, right? So now we've gone through all these different items. We've gone through the inspections. We negotiated through the inspections. Now we've got the seller's disclosure. The seller's disclosure is a document that the seller hands over to the buyer. If there is one, because perhaps there isn't one, if the seller never lived in the property, there won't be one, and that's okay. There's something else called right here in blue, the association documents. Those are called HOA, Homeowners Association Documents. This comes into play anytime you're buying or selling a property that's either deed restricted, has a homeowner association, condominium, gated community. All those things trigger in your head. HOA documents are mandatory to deliver to the buyer. If you guys remember this from school, do you guys remember the term 3-day right of rescission? The 3-day right of rescission pertains to this document here, the association documents. What that is let's say, for example, I'm going to buy a property in, let's call it Lexington, right? That's one of the local areas we have here. Lexington is a deed restricted, it's a property that has HOA, right? So what happens is I make my offer, we arrive at a price, we sign the contract, fantastic. Now the selling agent, the listing agent, is going to deliver to the buyer's agent a set of documents. Inside of those documents is everything pertaining to the homeowners association. The budget, the terms, the cost, the fees, the services, everything involved in one. Sometimes it's 40 pages, sometimes I've seen them 80 pages, and sometimes longer than that. So everything in there is part of what the buyer is expected to participate, right? So from the moment I receive that, I'm the buyer. From the moment I receive the HOA documents, I now have 3 days to explore those documents and 3 days to decide I don't want to live there. And that's a Florida protected right that I have called the Florida 3-day right of rescission. That means if I'm looking over these documents and I don't like the terms, I have 3 days to decide I don't want to move into this property, regardless of when the inspection was, regardless of any other terms in the contract. Because I have the homeowner association documents and Florida gives me a 3-day right of rescission, I can cancel the contract within those 3 days. So if let's play a little role here. Let's say that we have a contract with a 15-day inspection period, right? 15 days come and go, and I'm still in the deal. I'm the buyer. I'm still in the process. I'm going to buy this property. On day number 17, someone hands me the homeowners association packet, right? The whole documents. I start reading through it. So now on day number 18, which is a day and a half later or whatever, I find that there's some terms in there that I don't want to comply with. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to buy it. So I get to decide single-handedly, basically, unilaterally, if you will, that I'm not going to buy the property, and no one can stop me. Basically, I'm protected by Florida law that says I'm not going to buy the property. I receive my escrow. But what happens is, it's a shame for that to happen on day number 18, on day number 19. Ideally, these HOA docs should be delivered to the buyer on day number 2, 3, 4, 5, perhaps all the way to 7, maybe 10 at the latest. Why? Because we want those 3-day right of rescission to expire before the inspection period. That way you line them up together and you're saving time, right? Because we want the inspection period, whenever that is, whether it's 15 days or 12 days or 14 days, whenever that expires, we want the contract to go firm. We want it to, we want to show the buyer, here's the terms, here's the condition of the property via the inspections, you're good to go, let's negotiate for whatever's broken, work with the seller, maybe you get a little credit or not, but the whole point is that on day number 15, you have everything in place. You're no longer worried about inspections, you're no longer worried about the association docs. We will be talking a little bit more about appraisals next, okay? But I wanted to share with you how the HOA documents sort of come into play and how they have the potential to derail a transaction, all right? Any questions? You guys know that I'm here for that. Let's talk a little bit about the appraisal and why is there an arrow there that goes from the appraisal back up to the red negotiations there. The reason why is because of this. Every time there's an appraisal on a property that has a mortgage on it, right? We got to play with some numbers. So we're going to go through some examples. Let's say that I have a property under contract for $100,000. And let's say that I'm getting an FHA loan, for example, right? Different loans carry different terms, but FHA is a 96.5 funding loan. What that means is that the bank is going to lend me 96.5% of appraised value, not contract value. Keep that in mind. Appraised value, not contract value. So I've got a property under contract for $100,000. I'm going to assume that the bank is going to lend me 96.5% of that because that's the type of loan that I'm getting as an FHA. But let's say the property appraises now for $90,000 instead of $100,000. Well, now we're going to have a problem because here's what's going to happen. The bank is going to tell me, the buyer, the bank is going to say, okay, Ernesto, we're going to lend you 96.5% per your FHA documents of appraised value. So the bank is going to lend me 96.5% of $90,000, not 96.5% of $100,000. I would like for them to loan me the whole thing, but the property did not appraise. So as it not appraised, now the bank is going to say to me, the buyer, if you want to buy the property, you got to come up with the difference, right? So I got to come up with a 3.5% to reach 90,000 plus another 10. This here is the second reason why transactions fail. The first reason is because of the inspections. The second reason is because of the appraisals. The appraisals account for a ton of destroyed transactions later in the process, usually around week number 4. So what happens is the appraisal comes in low. This is exactly why we go back to negotiations, right? We say the buyer can't make up the difference. I can't make up the difference, to come up with 3.5% to make it to 90,000 plus another 10 to make it to 100. I don't have that kind of cash, as most buyers who are buying FHA usually do not. So then we go to the seller and we say, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Seller, the property that we were going to buy from you for $100,000 actually did not appraise. We have an appraisal here. It's at $90,000. The appraisal itself, if it's a government-backed appraisal like an FHA, will stick to the house like glue for 120 days. So the negotiations, the leverage to negotiate now belongs to the buyer, because the buyer says, Mr. or Mrs. Seller, your property is going to be appraised for the next 120 days at $90,000. So aside from somebody coming in and buying it cash, the next person that comes in is also going to, for the next 120 days, is also going to be valued at 90,000 rather than 100,000. So how about we negotiate a little bit here? How about you maybe bring it down to 93 or 94, maybe 95? I can come up with a few more $1,000. Maybe I can come up with 95 and we make a deal at 95. That's very possible and it's very doable, and it happens all the time. The whole point that I'm sharing with you here is that low appraisals open up a window to negotiate once again. And that's how it works. Does that make sense? So the property didn't appraise. Let's go back. Let's see if we can figure something out. A lot of times the seller says, no, I'm not going to drop the price. Have a nice day. You guys can go ahead and walk. The buyer walks away. If there's a couple of different things that happen with the escrow, because it matters if the finance contingency is in play. The finance contingency is a date that expires in a contract. We'll talk about that when we do the contracts a little bit later. The appraisal can happen at any time, but the appraisal can derail the transaction, and it then matters where the financing contingency date is at. Is it past us? Is it behind us? Or is it still in front of us? If it's in front of us, the buyer has more leverage to keep a major portion of that escrow. And if the finance contingency period has already ended some weeks ago, then the buyer loses such leverage to keep that escrow. And the escrow becomes challenged, okay? So again, if you're on the buyer side, let's try and keep the escrow low. If you're on the seller side, let's try and keep the escrow high. All of that has to do with how the contracts unfold over time. So we're not going to spend a ton of time on appraisals here because we're going to talk about them more when we dig into the contracts. But here, in the anatomy of a real estate transaction, I'm showing it to you as to what it does and how it works and why it very commonly triggers another round of negotiations, all right? So that's pretty much most of what we have going on here with the anatomy of a transaction. Next thing to talk about is right here in purple with the insurance, the survey. These things are not super, they are critical. So don't get me wrong, they are critical, but they're not real estate critical. They are transaction critical. So we have to have insurance. We don't actually have to go there and worry about the terms and everything like that. Same with the survey. The survey is handled by the title agency. Sometimes there's a survey from an older closing and sometimes there's not. Either way, it's fine. Once we get past those items, we go into the closing document right here, purple here at the bottom, closing document / inspection. Then we go through the walkthrough. I'm going to share with you what we do in the walkthrough. And then, of course, the best day in real estate is the closing day. So the closing document and the inspection and the walkthrough, they happen within a day or two of the actual closing. We, as real estate agents, never want to execute a walkthrough without the buyer present. Why is that? Because we inherently grab a lot of liability in doing so during that process, right? The idea is that we walk with our buyer, we go to the property, we open it, they do their own walkthrough. What happens in Florida a lot, which I'm going to share with you, is a lot of times the buyers will be closing on a property, but they're not here. They're out of town. They're in another state. They're in another country. So they're going to say to you, Mr. Agent, Mr. Ernesto, Mrs. Agent, whatever, I need you to do the walkthrough for me. The answer to that is, well, we cannot actually do the walkthrough for you because we cannot take on such responsibility of something as big as a walkthrough. What we can do is we can reach back out to the inspections, right? The inspector, remember that in gray from earlier today? Very commonly, the inspector will be able to revisit the property pre-closing for a fee to go out to the property. Usually it's about $100. So for $100, it's so worth it to have the inspector go back out to the property, do a quick walk around, make sure the property is in the same condition as it was when he or she delivered the inspection, and then deliver a second form that says property is as expected, pre-closing, blah, blah, blah. Boom, you're off the hook. You don't have to do the inspection or the walkthrough rather, and you go right into the closing. All right. So that's pretty much it for the anatomy of a transaction. I'm here for any questions that you might need. This is, of course, only the very top layer of a real estate transaction. We dig deeper into this stuff. I've got all the contracts right here waiting to teach you those tomorrow or the next day. So all of this stuff is going into video, and I'm super excited to have this available for everybody at any time. All right. So love you guys. The closing is it. It's a heart. It's where the money comes from, and it's what you earn for doing all the amazing work that you do. All right, I'll catch you guys next time. Bye-bye.